Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 653, an intro to wisdom, part 3, the truth about spiritual warfare and the perfect will of Elohim. The podcast objectives are restate the intersection of Yahuwah's will, analyze the critical nature of spiritual warfare, analyze the key to fighting a good fight, and analyze the reality of those who are outside of Yahuwah's perfect will. Welcome. Now, before we begin today's lesson, I would like to welcome all my beloved brothers and sisters in Yahushua Messiah who have been scattered to the four corners of the earth, who Yahuwah has joined to this ministry for such a time as this. I would also like to welcome anyone who is engaging our podcast or videos for the first time. We trust you were led by the set apart spirit in finding us. And if you continue to be led, we hope you stay with us. For these are troubling times, and an evil day is just ahead. To this end, if you are watching this video on YouTube and you have not subscribed to our channel, click the subscribe button below, and you will be alerted whenever we post new videos. Also, if you have any questions at the conclusion of this video, you can ask them using the link in the podcast description below the video player. Last but not least, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up so YouTube can share it with believers like us. The intersection of Yahuwah's will. Shalom, my beloved brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 689 of our exposition of lawlessness. In the most recent podcast, we began analyzing the path we must follow for the perfect will of Elohim to be done in our lives. In doing so, we came to the following conclusion. You will never understand Yahuwah's perfect will if you don't understand the most basic models of his will. Enter his permissive will and his decreed will. Now, we analyze these two models of Yahuwah's will in a prior podcast. And on Monday, we came to see how tests, trials, and spiritual warfare are the intersection of these two models of his will. And seeing as we addressed tests and trials on Monday, today we will address spiritual warfare, and we will begin to address tribulations, which are not a part of Yahuwah's will at all. And so, let's get started. Spiritual warfare is coming. Now, first things first, the lesson on Monday should have made at least one thing very clear. To wit, the majority of so-called believers struggle to appreciate the nature and or purpose of our tests and trials. Here lies the inflection. To wit, these so-called believers may believe in something, but they are not on the path to perfection. We know this because tests and trials are the foundation of Yahuwah's perfect will. To wit, he uses tests, and trials to push us towards the point of perfection in his set apart spirit. Ergo, all the lines and precepts you see in the model to the left represent the tests and trials we will encounter in our quest. Praise Yah. Now, that was the inflection. Here is the problem. Vis-a-vis, the majority of so-called believers may be on a quest, but they are not on this quest. We know this because they have never passed the trials of obedience and faith. My dear friends, obedience and faith are what we call spiritual first grade, to wit, the most basic level of spirituality. And the majority of so-called believers have never made it past this grade of holiness. Now, that was the inflection. Here is the problem. Vis-a-vis, the same way that our trials are evolutions of our tests, spiritual battles are evolutions of our trials. Ergo, you will never succeed in spiritual warfare if you fail to pass your tests and trials. Not only this, but spiritual warfare is not delimited outside of the path to perfection. Plainly speaking, the life events you experience outside of the way of holiness are not governed by the perfect will of Elohim. Quite the contrary, they are governed by time and chance, two factors of life that favor those who have the greater power, authority, and dominion. Now, that was the inflection. Here is the problem. Vis-a-vis, the kingdom of darkness has the highest levels of power, authority, and dominion of all who are outside the way of holiness. And thus, the following is true. When you fall into the hands of time and chance, the greatest influence in your life will be the kingdom of darkness. And this is why the majority of all men, despite their beliefs, are suffering at the hands of this evil confederacy. Alas, the enemy is coming into their lives to kill, to steal, and to destroy. And there is nothing they can do about it. Now, this example only speaks to those who are outside of the way of holiness, to wit, those false believers who refuse to walk in the path to perfection and yet fail to realize that this is the only way we can guard ourselves from the powers of darkness. As I say, these bad actors have no chance of succeeding in spiritual warfare. And yet, spiritual warfare is coming. Let me tell you something. We will all have our date with the kingdom of darkness. Remember, this alliance of evil obtained dominion in the earth at the beginning of man's day. And the only way we can combat their dominion is by the authority of Elohim, which is transferred to us by Yahushua Messiah as we follow his steps, i.e., the path to perfection. Now, let's talk logistics. Vis-a-vis, spiritual warfare can occur at any point in your quest. However, there is a difference between the spiritual warfare you experience at the beginning of your quest and that which you experience after. Now, as you have learned, you will experience an upsurge in your levels of authority after you unlock the power of wisdom, i.e., the final degree of power in the Tehuda of Yahushua Messiah. Ergo, the spiritual battles you fight from faith to wisdom are internal battles with all the degrees of lawlessness that are within you. Now, per the image to the right, these are all the degrees from doubt to vanity. As I say, the leading days in your quest are depicted by internal battles with these degrees of lawlessness. And as you have learned, the only way you will succeed is by putting on the whole armor of Elohim. If you do, then you will not only be positioned to do greater works, you, my friend, will be able to fight greater battles. Now, you can see this by the image to the right. Vis-a-vis, once you put on the whole armor of Elohim and you are operating in his authority, you will be fashioned for next level spiritual warfare. To wit, unlike the spiritual flunkies who are drowning in sin and lawlessness, you, my friend, will take the battle to the enemy. And this is how you reclaim your destiny. This, my friends, is how you turn back your captivity. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, if you are to fulfill your destiny and turn back your captivity, at some point you will have to deal with the kingdom of darkness. And if you don't take the battle to them, believe me, they will bring the battle to you. As I say, spiritual warfare is coming, and the only way you will win is if and only if you prepare yourself by passing your tests and your trials, and by putting on the whole armor of Elohim, which is the source of your authority. Praise Yah. To fight a good fight. Now, as I say, this may be a novel word to many, but it's only because the vast majority of so-called believers are not even on this quest. And if they are, they have never gotten this far. For again, they struggle to pass their trials and their tests. No doubt, this is why they will never experience the main event of spiritual warfare. That is, the level of spiritual warfare where you go on the offensive. To wit, the interval where you become the hunter and the enemy becomes the hunted. Now, it should be clear that this is the only way you will ever survive spiritual warfare. My dear friends, hear me carefully as I say, when the enemy takes on the role of the hunter, he will always succeed in murder, destruction, and thievery. For look, listen, it has been written, your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking someone he may devour. Here lies the inflection, which I advise you to consider carefully. Satan is only looking to go to war with someone who he knows he can defeat in spiritual battle. To wit, someone who is not wearing the whole armor of Elohim. Therefore, when Satan is in the role of the hunter, he is only going to mess with someone he knows he can devour. And believe me, he will devour. And the only way we can avoid this fate is by putting on the whole armor of Elohim. Now, if you do, you get the opportunity to turn the tables on the enemy. You, my friend, become the great devourer by wreaking havoc in his kingdom. Praise Yah. Now, to our good fortune, that reality is just around the corner. Per the image to the left, your conquest against the kingdom of darkness begins at the next level in our quest. Enter temperance. At this juncture, you, my friend, will be elevated to the active army, to wit, the division of the kingdom of Elohim, where his messengers war against the kingdom of darkness to ensure that his will is done in the earth as it is in the heavens. Now, there are many things to say about this amazing reality, and we will analyze them in the next series when we transition to the analysis of temperance and all the degrees of balance. Until then, here is what you need to know. There are two primary phases in this quest. The first phase is designed to prepare you for the spiritual battles you must fight to secure your destiny of everlasting life. And the second phase is centered on fighting those battles and obtaining every victory according to the desire of Elohim. Now, this is just one of the many reasons why wisdom is one of the more critical degrees of perfection. It is because wisdom is at the intersection of the two primary phases in your quest. It is where the transition begins. This is why all the degrees of balance and perfection are expressions of wisdom. Remember, wisdom is the procedural model of holiness. Ergo, wisdom reveals the how factor concerning every frame of our quest. And as I have told you many times before, the how factor is the most critical factor. Trust me, this is especially the case when it comes to spiritual warfare. For victory is not obtained by simply showing up to the battle. Quite the contrary, you, my friend, must fight a good fight. And you learn how to fight a good fight by mastering all the lines and precepts of wisdom. After which, your directive is quite simple. That is, to fight a good fight, and you will have everlasting life. You have no path to success. Now, here again, the wisdom I am sharing is not mainstream. And believe me, this is a trend that is not going to end. My dear friends, the majority within this nation will never see the truth that the Most High is revealing to you and me. Not only this, but wisdom, unlike knowledge, can only come by experience. Let me tell you something. This is the primary difference between the countless false prophets and the few prophets of Elohim. To wit, these false fools are not experiencing Elohim because they are outside of his will. And yet, they are more than willing to lead men and women down spiritual paths that have not been confirmed, for these paths are outside of his will. Here is why this is such a huge issue. Every spiritual path that is outside of Yahuwah's will is a conduit into darkness, which leads to the progression of death and the 16 deadliest degrees of lawlessness. Now, we know this because there is only one path that leads to everlasting life, and the Ruach will always lighten this path to ensure that we do not deviate from the way. As the saying goes, he will keep you if you want to stay. Here lies the problem vis-a-vis the majority of men and women don't want to stay. As I say, they are spiritual failures who don't have what it takes to operate in spirit and truth. And their persistent failure is persistent proof. However, these bad actors want to believe that they are in the will of Elohim. And this is why they will be deceived by the countless false prophets who are only in this world to lead men and women outside the will of Elohim. And because deception is involved, these spiritual delinquents will have no idea that they are being led astray. And if that wasn't bad enough, believe me, it gets much worse. Consider this. Even though false Hebrews are outside of the way of holiness, they will yet be forced to endure tests, trials, and spiritual warfare. Now, here lies a problem, and I touched on it in the prior section. To wit, when you experience tests, trials, and spiritual warfare outside of the way of holiness, you have no path to success. My dear friends, hear me carefully as I say, unlike the tests, trials, and spiritual warfare we endure in our quest for holiness, perfection, and everlasting life, the tests, trials, and spiritual warfare that the false Hebrews are enduring are not designed to make them stronger. Quite the contrary, the tests, trials, and spiritual warfare they endure are designed to destroy them. And this is why there is an infinite premium on wisdom and unlocking the power to do the will of Elohim. For it is not his will that any should perish, but many men and women are perishing because they are outside of his will. Ergo, his will is not being done in their lives. On the rather, their lives are being destroyed by the will of the wicked one, and they will become casualties to the fourth most prominent event in this quest. Enter tribulations, i.e., the persistent reality of all who persist outside of the perfect will of Elohim. Now, we will discuss this topic next week. Until then, I encourage you to seek the Most High concerning these matters. And if you consider these truths to be uncommon wisdom, you must remember this. There is nothing more uncommon than a man who is truly committed to doing Yahuwah's perfect will. Selah. Now, here is the final word. Put on your armor, take out your sword. The time is now for spiritual war. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, you will obtain nothing of eternal value if you are not willing to fight for it, and if you are not willing to die for it. And this is why the path that leads to everlasting life is hardly traveled. It is because hardly anyone is willing to die. And yet, while the enemy is wreaking havoc in their lives, these poor fools are wondering why. Heretofore, I recommend, don't be deceived. There is no path to victory where a man is unwilling to go to war. For every man must deal with the kingdom of darkness. For the enemy is coming. He is knocking at your door. Now, here is today's assignment. Meditate on today's lesson. And if you have any questions, please submit them using the form at pinnacleofholiness.com. And I will respond to you as soon as I can. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 653, an Intro to Wisdom, Part 3. And the next podcast is entitled Greater Works You Shall Do, Part 8. I will post this podcast on Friday, May 22nd, 2026. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the Spirit of Elohim, continue to watch, continue to pray, continue in fasting, and most of all, continue to be focused, for the end is coming. The end is near.